Hello everyone, I'm back. This is my series, Colonies to Colossus, The Rise of a Giant. In today's podcast, we're going to look at Boston, the rebellious town. This is number 43 in my series. Before we get started on that, please remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons. We are a small channel and still growing. It's often been said that Philadelphia was the cradle of the American Revolution, but it's just as true that Boston was the flashpoint and the engine of the revolution. In this podcast, we're going to explore why it was that Boston was so often resistant and rebellious to the mother country. The other large towns in North America, New York, Philadelphia, and Charlestown, South Carolina, certainly engaged in resistance too, but not to the same degree, and they even looked to Boston for leadership. In my last episode, we talked about the Townshend program for the colonies and the opposition to it. One of the leaders of the opposition was a man named John Dickinson from Pennsylvania, who wrote a series of newspaper articles criticizing the Townshend program. He called them Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer. But Dickinson, as with all the other colonists, looked to Massachusetts Bay Colony, particularly Boston, for leadership when it came to opposing British measures. Dickinson wrote a letter to James Otis, one of the leaders in Boston, saying, "Whenever the cause of American freedom is to be vindicated, I look towards the province of Massachusetts Bay. She must, as she has hitherto done, first kindle the sacred flame." Boston was originally part of a godly commonwealth founded by Puritans who frowned on profiteering, but these older notions were soon swept away as Boston became a commercial giant and the largest city in North America. However, by the end of the French and Indian War in the 1760s, Boston was no longer the largest city in North America, even though Boston remained a commercial giant. In 1770, Boston's population hovered around 16,000, while New York's population burgeoned to 22,000, and Philadelphia's exploded to 34,000. The only other large town in the colonies was Charlestown, South Carolina, which had a population close to 11,000 in 1770. Some of the reasons that Boston failed to continue to grow as much as these other colonies did was that it's basically on an island. You'll see in some of the maps we're going to look at that Boston's an island, and it's hard for the population to expand much beyond that. In addition to that, there's not a lot of surrounding arable land to grow enough food to feed a bigger population as Philadelphia and New York had. They had a lot of arable land that could support farming and agriculture. All right, before we go any further, I thought it would be a good idea to take a look at what Boston looked like back then versus what it looks like today. So the black lines indicate what Boston's shoreline was back in colonial times. The red lines indicate what it looks like today. So Boston has been radically transformed by filling in the bay and expanding the size of it. So basically back then it was an island, whereas today it's kind of more of just part of the mainland. And when Boston was first founded, it was divided into 12 wards for administrative reasons. If you look at the right-hand bottom corner, you'll see a little black dot called Castle Island. There was a fort there, and very frequently throughout the troubles and rioting that went on in Boston, the governor fled there for safety. He wasn't the only one. Other government officials did too, such as the customs board members. So from the outlines, you can see how radically Boston has changed from its original geographic configuration. But as radical as that changes, I think the religious cultural changes even more. There's now a heavy Catholic influence in Boston, and I think the people at the time of the Revolution would have been maybe disheartened by that. It's hard to imagine a town that was more rabidly anti-Catholic than Boston was. On the screen right now is a map of historic colonial Boston, and I've shown some of the houses and other locations on there with labels so you know what they are and where they were located. I thought it would be a good idea to take a little tour of Boston, what it was like in colonial times. We'll start at the bottom of the screen and work our way up. So the first place we come to is a green dot, and that's the Liberty Tree. Most of the colonies in their larger towns or cities had either a Liberty Tree or Liberty Pole, which served as an important rallying point for the Sons of Liberty, and it was often the place where mob activity began. All right, on the screen now is a depiction of what the Liberty Tree may have looked like, and it was a place where the Sons of Liberty would hang effigies of royal officials, which would have been intimidating. That meant they could be abused or were next on the list for abuse or possibly even death. It was a place where they hung lists of people that were traitors or considered traitors for helping or supporting British measures. It was also a place where sometimes royal officials were summoned to appear and forced to resign their offices, which is something I talked about earlier in my previous podcast about the Sons of Liberty. Governor Francis Bernard, who was the royal governor of Massachusetts, kept or sent copious letters to his superiors in London informing them of the rebellious activities in Boston. In a letter dated June 16, 1768, he sent this description of the Liberty Tree to his boss, the Earl of Hillsborough, in London. He wrote, "I come now to give your lordship an account of the meeting at Liberty Tree. Your lordship must know that Liberty Tree is a large old elm in the High Street, upon which the effigies were being hung in the time of the Stamp Act, and from whence the mobs at their time made their parades. It has since been adorned with an inscription, and has obtained the name of Liberty Tree, as the ground under it has that of Liberty Hall. In August last, just before the commencement of the present troubles, they erected a flagstaff which went through the tree and a good deal above the top of the tree. Upon this they hoist a flag as a symbol for them, meaning the Sons of Liberty, as they are called. This tree has often put me in mind of Jack Cade's Oak of Reformation." And he's referring to Jack Cade, who was a rebel several centuries before this to the king in England. Liberty Tree was eventually chopped down by British troops, but after the American Patriots reoccupied Boston and the British had evacuated it, they erected a Liberty pole there instead. And interestingly, the concept of Liberty trees and Liberty poles outlived the American Revolution. During George Washington's term as president, there was an event called the Whiskey Rebellion in backstate Pennsylvania, and some of the Whiskey Rebellion supporters actually erected Liberty poles there too. All right, working our way further north on our map, you can see Samuel Adams' house north of the Liberty Tree, and just to the right of Samuel Adams' house is the Province House. This was the official residence of the royal governors of Massachusetts. Across the street from the Province House is Benjamin Franklin's birthplace. Franklin's so heavily associated with Philadelphia that a lot of people don't know that he was actually born and raised in Boston, where he spent his first years of life. Just north and across the street from Franklin's birthplace is the Old South Meeting House. It was one of the largest buildings in Boston, and often town meetings were held there. It's the place where the Boston Tea Party began and the mob assembled and speeches were given before they went down to destroy the tea at Griffin's Wharf. A little north of the Old South Meeting House is the Town House, which is often known today as the Old State House. This is the official Capitol building of the colony of Massachusetts Bay. It's a place where both houses of the legislature met, and it was also the place where the governor's office was located. On the screen is a nice photograph of the old townhouse or the old state house as it currently appears. It's quite small compared to all the newer buildings that have come up around it. A lot of important historic events and things happened either in the old townhouse or right outside of it that relative to colonial history as well as during the American Revolution. In the center of the building, you can see this big white balcony. A lot of important announcements have been made from that balcony. For example, in 1761, the ascension of George III to the throne was announced from that balcony. A few years later, in 1776, the Declaration of Independence, which threw out King George III, was also read from that balcony. In 1780, while the American Revolution was still being fought, Massachusetts had declared itself an independent state, and John Hancock was proclaimed from that balcony as its first governor, as an independent state. I think that one of the most interesting things to happen from that balcony occurred in 1976 when we were celebrating our nation's bicentennial. Queen Elizabeth II visited to celebrate the bicentennial with us, and here she is. You can see a picture of her waving to a crowd from that balcony, the very same one where the Declaration of Independence was read. She later came down from the balcony and she gave a speech. I'm going to read an excerpt from it because it fits so perfectly with what we're talking about that I think it's worth reading. She said, "If Paul Revere, Samuel Adams, and other patriots could have known that one day a British monarch would stand beneath the balcony of the old State House, from which the Declaration of Independence was first read to the people of Boston, and be greeted by the mayor and others in such generous words, well, I think they would have been extremely surprised." She went on to say, "But perhaps they would also have been pleased to know that eventually we came together again as free peoples and friends and defended together the very ideals for which the American Revolution was fought." And you can see there the Queen interacting with some guys dressed in British military uniforms from the 1700s, interacting with the Queen and the townhouse or old state houses in the background. It's now a museum. Okay, just a little bit to the right or east of the townhouse is the Bunch of Grapes Tavern, which sometimes Sons of Liberty met and held their meetings there. There's also the Customs House and Faneuil Hall. That was one of the halls where town meetings often occurred. It was a smaller hall back then. It was enlarged later, and oftentimes town meetings had to be held at the Old South Meeting Hall. If we go to the left or west of the town hall, we can see the John Hancock Mansion, and Beacon Hill. Beacon Hill had a tall beacon on it that could be lit into a bonfire as a signal during times of invasion or other emergencies. And just a little north and to the left of the townhouse was Dr. Joseph Warren's house, which is no longer there. We'll have more to say about Joseph Warren. He was an important leader in Massachusetts at this time, an important Patriot leader. A little to the north and right of Joseph Warren's house was the Green Dragon Tavern. The Green Dragon Tavern was both a Masonic lodge and the informal headquarters of the Sons of Liberty. Paul Revere wrote, "We held our meetings at the Green Dragon Tavern. We were so careful that our meetings should be kept secret that every time we met, every person swore upon the Bible that they would not discover any of our transactions but to Messrs. Hancock, Adams, Drs. Warren and Church, and one or two more." So it was a place where the Sons of Liberty planned their different activities. And in the old drawing on the screen there, you can see the little green dragon hanging over the main entrance. There is currently a Green Dragon Tavern in Boston, and it's near where the site of the original one was, but it's not the original one. Okay, moving north on our map to the remaining few buildings in northern Boston, you can see the Hutchinson Mansion. Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson was probably one of the most despised people that the Sons of Liberty hated. His mansion would be almost nearly completely destroyed. We'll have a description of that later in the podcast during the Stamp Act Riots. A little off to the right there, you can see Hancock's Wharf. That's where the most serious rioting occurred during the Townsend Program riots. You can also see Paul Revere's house, which was built in the 1600s, and it's still there today. And lastly, we come to the Old North Church. That's the place where Paul Revere had the lanterns hung as signals to his fellow Sons of Liberty in Charlestown, one if by land, two if by sea. So exactly why was Boston so rebellious? Some historians postulate that economic or social reasons were the overriding reasons that Massachusetts and Boston in particular were so rebellious. I don't think that's true, though. I think that the political culture of Massachusetts, which was an extension of its religious culture, was the overriding factor. The people who founded Massachusetts and Plymouth Colony, they had been merged into one colony later, were Puritans. They had a deeply held hatred for the Church of England, and there was an anti-royal tone to their beliefs. You remember earlier I talked in my podcast about the Glorious Revolution, about the Civil War that happened in 1640 between Parliament and the King. Parliament was heavily Puritan, and the person who led the parliamentary armies, Oliver Cromwell, was also heavily Puritan himself. After the Civil War, the king was captured and he was eventually beheaded. And the Puritans were deeply sympathetic to what Oliver Cromwell and Parliament had done in dealing with the king that way. In fact, one of the members of the Massachusetts House of Representatives had invoked the name of Oliver Cromwell, and Governor Bernard reported it. He said, in another part of his speech, he passed an encomium on Oliver Cromwell and extolled the times preceding his advancement, and particularly the murder of the king. The people of New England, in fact all the colonies, were deeply steeped in Whig political philosophy. This is the philosophy, I talked about this earlier also in the Glorious Revolution podcast. This is the philosophy that was developed after they disposed of James II, and Parliament invited a new person to become king. And they came up with a political philosophy to justify what they had done, and it included the right of people to resist corrupt kings or government officials. And much of what was said by people who extolled the Whig political philosophy, especially John Locke, ended up in our Declaration of Independence. It sounds much like something that would have been written by one of these Whig political philosophers a century before the War of Independence. So from the very beginning, Massachusetts Bay Colony and Plymouth Colony, even though they were later merged, it was resistant to rule by England. There were also structural issues as to why these colonies were resistant. There was a decidedly democratic tone to the politics of New England. They had open town meetings, which the governors hated. In fact, Governor Bernard, writing back to his superiors in London complaining about these town meetings, said, "So we are not without a government, only it is in the hands of the people at the town and not of their deputies by the king or under his authority." Boston citizens also formed caucus clubs. These were clubs to both discuss politics as well as to influence politics. In fact, it was out of these caucus clubs that the Sons of Liberty came. Another important factor were the newspapers. Boston was the first town in the colonies to have a newspaper. And the newspapers gave vent to a lot of the opinions on both sides, but especially on the side of the Patriots. And in fact, it was the newspapers that were calling for independence years before anyone else was considering it. Another important factor that led to the instability in Boston's politics were the large number of maritime workers, sailors and seamen that were there at any given moment. These people could easily be incorporated into mobs or joining mob activity. Once Massachusetts Bay Colony and Plymouth Colony, we all know the story of Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims. Once those two colonies were formed, none of the kings were ever happy with them. They were always resistant. And in fact, in the 1680s, they began the process of revoking both Massachusetts's and Plymouth colonies' charters. And in 1691, the king granted them a new charter. He combined the two colonies and made some changes to the charters to open them up to be a little more pluralistic for religious reasons. One of the important annual events that occurred in Boston every November 5th was Pope's Day, sometimes called Pope's Night. I want to give you a little description and information about this because it really does give you an idea of how turbulent Boston was. Now, November 5th was celebrated as Guy Fawkes Day in England. It was a day in which a plot to blow up the House of Lords and the king and return England to Catholicism was foiled back in 1605. So in England, they celebrated it as Guy Fawkes Day, the day that the gunpowder plot was foiled. Well, Boston took it a step further, and they called it Pope's Day. So how this worked was the people in the north end of town would create effigies of the Pope, maybe put them on wagons, and the people at the south end of town would do the same thing, and they would parade towards each other, meeting somewhere in the middle, and then have this big giant brawl that with cudgels and sticks and other things, pieces of barrel staves, which resulted in a lot of injuries, some of them permanent. People lost teeth, they had broken bones, and the winning side got to take the opposing side's effigy of the Pope and then burn it. I want to read a brief description of how Pope's Day went by an observer. This was published in the Boston Evening Post in 1745, and it says, "The popes were made and carried through the streets in the evening, one from the north and another from the south end of the town, attended by a vast number of negroes and white servants armed with clubs, staves, and cutlasses, who were very abusive to the inhabitants, insulting the persons and breaking the windows, etc., of such as did not give them money to their satisfaction, and even many of those who had given liberally, and the two popes meeting in Cornhill. Their followers were so infatuated as to fall upon each other with the utmost rage and fury. Several were sorely wounded and bruised, and some left for dead, and rendered incapable of any business for a long time, to the great loss and damage of their respective masters." So violence was an important part of Boston's culture to begin with. And these Pope's Day riots kind of provided a chance for people to learn how to be leaders in mob activities, as we'll see later. The leaders of these Pope's Day riots are heavily involved in the mob activity against British officials. On the screen right now, you can see a drawing or an illustration that was published in a publication back in the 1760s of one of the Pope's Day's effigies. You can see the Pope sitting in his throne on a wagon, and behind him is the devil probably whispering in his ear or telling him something, surrounded by a crowd of people, which kind of gives you an idea of what this must have looked like. The most serious riots to ever occur in Boston's history were the Stamp Act Riots in the August of 1765. What made those riots particularly effective was that the North End mob, led by Henry Swift, and the South End mob, led by Ebenezer McIntosh, and these are the two mobs that fought each other in the center of town during Pope's Day, combined their forces to terrorize certain British officials. On August 14th, the mobs started out, as they always did, at the Liberty Tree, and then marched over to the near-complete offices of Andrew Oliver, which is near the Bunch of Grapes Tavern. You can see it there, that little blue explosion on the map. That's where it was, and they destroyed it. They then headed a little south to Andrew Oliver's home, and damaging it, pulling up the boards and the fencing, and carrying it up to Fort Hill and setting a bonfire. You can see the second little blue explosion further to the south. On August 26th, the mobs formed again and attacked the mansion of Thomas Hutchinson. You can see that depicted in the red explosion towards the north end of town there. Hutchinson's house was almost nearly destroyed, and they worked on destroying it piece by piece until sun up, apparently. Some of the mob split off, though, and damaged the homes of some other royal officials, which I show there nearby with those red explosions. Now, luckily for Hutchinson, he got out in time. He would later become a governor of Massachusetts after Bernard was sent home. He was hated by the Sons of Liberty, and he was able to get out of the house before he was attacked himself. But he described the damage to his house in these terms. He said, "The hellish crew, not contented with tearing off all the wainscot and hangings and splitting the doors to pieces, they beat down the partition walls, cut down the cupola, and began to take the slate and boards from the roof. The garden fence was laid flat, and all my trees, etc., broke down to the ground. Besides my plate and family pictures, household furniture of every kind, my own, my children, and servants' apparel, they carried off about 900 pounds sterling in money and emptied the house of everything whatsoever, not leaving a single book or paper in it, and have scattered or destroyed all the manuscripts and other papers I had been collecting for 30 years together, besides a great number of public papers in my custody." Now, Ebenezer McIntosh, who was kind of assumed overall leadership of the mob, he was later arrested by the sheriff, but was quickly let out, and the sheriff was too afraid to go try and rearrest him or force the issue. Governor Bernard had sent several letters to London telling them that basically he had no control over events there. He had no troops. And the problem was that in order to land troops, the colonial charter of Massachusetts Bay required that the governor obtain the consent of the council. Now, the council was the upper house of the legislature, kind of like the Senate. They were terrified of the mobs themselves. They would not consent to landing troops. That would have certainly got them a visit from the Sons of Liberty and perhaps their effigies hung at the Liberty Tree. There was even talk of moving the colonial capital to Salem, where the mobs wouldn't be there to intimidate the government officials. At Governor Bernard's urging, the British government, decided to send troops into Boston, and they actually ordered the city of Boston to provide quarters for the troops. The city council tried to say that because Castle Island, which I pointed out earlier, was technically within the city limits, the troops could be housed there. And of course, that would have defeated the purpose for having the troops there. They wanted the troops in the town so they could enforce the British laws and things, and so the governor wouldn't have to constantly flee for his life. So as you can see in the map there, the troops were unloaded at the Long Wharf. This was a very long wharf that was built, and it had buildings on it. It was a very efficient place to load and unload goods and products from far away. The troops unloaded there, and they were paraded to the Boston Common. You can see on kind of the left side of town there, I put little red triangles showing the tents of the British troops where they would stay. Now, just to the right of the Boston Common, you can see a large building. It's kind of a large black box, and I put a red circle around it. This was the manufactory house. It was one of the largest buildings in Boston. It was originally built for widows to go and work, and their kids could stay with them, and they could produce linen. And it ended up not working, and the building was just kind of sitting there crumbling. There were a lot of squatters living in it. And Governor Bernard offered to allow that to be the place where the British troops could be quartered, because it could have held them all. And the town council was, of course, opposed to that. So Bernard took the initiative and ordered it to be used for that purpose anyway. And when the British troops got there, the squatters that were living there barred the doors. They wouldn't let the British troops in. So the British troops surrounded the building and tried to starve them out. This standoff went on for 2 days, and mobs of citizens, of course, stood outside of this ring of troops, throwing bread over their heads into the windows to keep the people living in there fed. And so they would have provisions, which angered the troops, and there were scuffles that broke out. In the end, the troops were never able to force their way into the building, and so the troops had to be relocated somewhere else. At this time, 2 whole regiments were put into Boston. I think it was enough troops to coerce obedience generally, but I don't think it was enough to actually scare Boston into submission. So really, in the end, just all it did was end up irritating Boston and inflaming them. There were constant scuffles and scrapes between the troops and Boston citizens, which just kept things stirred up. So at this point, Boston is primed and ready for further violence and rebellion. And in future podcasts, we're going to pick it up from here. But before we leave, I want to talk briefly about some of the important personalities in Boston. The first person I want to talk about is a guy named James Otis. You can see a picture of him on the screen right there. Otis was not originally from Boston. He was from another Massachusetts town called Barnstable, which had been further south. He was a good public speaker. John Adams described him as a flame of fire, and he was one of the leaders in opposition to British measures. I talked about him in a previous podcast that I did about the Stamp Act. Otis, however, had a certain amount of erratic mental health. He seemed to have spells where he wasn't himself. And in 1769, he ended up in a brawl in a coffee house with several Tories and British officials that he had criticized. The hatred was mutual. He was hit over the head pretty hard, and after that his mental health seemed to decline to the point where he couldn't function anymore, and he spent the remaining 13 years of his life staying with friends out in the country. Ironically, he was killed by a lightning bolt in 1783. With Otis becoming incapacitated, leadership now kind of shifted to a new leader, a guy named Samuel Adams, whose picture you can now see on the screen. We're going to say a lot more about him in future podcasts, and I don't want to spill the beans too much, but Adams was often described as the arch rebel, and he was hated by British officials. He's the kind of guy that could organize mob activity. He was chief of the mobs, and then in the next day decry the violence in newspaper articles and then blame it on the British. He was talking about independence long before anyone else was. The next guy I want to talk about is Dr. Joseph Warren, whose picture is now on the screen. The Patriots eventually set up a government, an alternate government, which was running the rest of Massachusetts, and this, of course, was illegal and could be seen as treason. Dr. Joseph Warren was selected as the president of it. It was called the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, and he must have been either really foolhardy or courageous. I think he was courageous. He didn't leave Boston. He could have been arrested for treason at any time, but he never did leave Boston. I think the British were afraid to arrest him and cause rioting. Joseph Warren was the one that organized the activities of the Patriots. He was the guy that Paul Revere reported to start his ride that night. We talked about that a little bit in my previous podcast about Paul Revere. He was the one that sent Paul Revere on the ride, as well as the other riders that we talked about. Like Samuel Adams and James Otis, he was bitingly critical of British officials. In fact, he wrote in one editorial in the Boston Gazette under the pseudonym A True Patriot, he wrote about the governor. He said, "Men totally abandoned to wickedness can never merit our regard, be their station ever so high. If such men are by God appointed, the devil may be the Lord's anointed." So that was quite intemperate, and it almost got him in some trouble. Sadly, a few months after Paul Revere's ride, Joseph Warren was leading troops at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he was killed in the fighting there. Had he survived, I think he would have been a national leader. Very possibly could have ended up as a candidate for the presidency after the war, after the Constitution was written. And even today, his name lives on. There's several counties in various states named Warren, and there's quite a few statues of him scattered around New England, especially in the Boston area. The last person I want to talk about is the guy on the screen now, a guy named John Wilkes. He is not an American. He was not an English colonist in North America. He was, in fact, a British or English politician. And in case you are a historian from the Civil War era, John Wilkes was related to John Wilkes Booth. You remember Booth is the one that assassinated President Abraham Lincoln. John Wilkes was elected several times to a seat in the House of Commons in the English Parliament. But he had written some very critical things of the king. He'd actually been arrested for them. And so the king, combining with his sympathizers in the House of Commons, denied Wilkes his seat there and appointed someone else instead. This happened several times, and it infuriated the voters of Wilkes' district. I mean, after all, they said, how can you deny us our vote? We voted for who we want. Who's the king to say we can't elect who we want? Wilkes was very sympathetic to the colonists, and the colonists viewed his cause as their cause as well. They saw what was happening to him as what was happening to them. And in fact, Joseph Warren, whom we just talked about, and other Patriot leaders in Boston had a nice correspondence going with Wilkes, and they were very sympathetic to each other's cause. In fact, voters in Wilkes' district were so outraged that it led to rioting, and several people were killed by troops, just like they would be in Boston in the Boston Massacre, which will be the subject of one of my upcoming podcasts. In western Pennsylvania today, there's a town called Wilkes-Barre. And the first part of that name, Wilkes, is from this John Wilkes. The second half of the name, Barry, is from the other member of Parliament, the English Parliament, who was critical of the Stamp Act and felt that it was not fair to the colonists. And he was the one that coined the phrase Sons of Liberty. I talked about that in my podcast about the Sons of Liberty. So both Wilkes and Barry live on today in this town in western Pennsylvania. Rioting was not unique or limited to the colonies. All of these Wilkes things that were happening, the riots, those were happening at the same time what was going on in Boston was happening. And in fact, just a few years later in 1780, as the American War of Independence was raging, there were the Gordon riots in London where tens of thousands of people were involved. And it got so bad that troops had to be called into London and several hundred people were killed during the riots. So rioting was not unique to the colonies. One of the reasons people rioted back then was because there was really no effective mechanism for fixing things that were wrong with the government. You had to either take things in your own hand and force it, or just learn to live with it. For further reading on this subject, I recommend the following books and articles. Boston and the American Revolution, A Town versus an Empire by Brooke Barbier. Cradle of Violence, How Boston's Waterfront Mobs Ignited the American Revolution by Russell Bourne. Letters to the Ministry from Governor Bernard, General Gage, and Commodore Hood, and also memorials to the Lords of the Treasury from the Commissioners of the Customs, with sundry letters and papers annexed to the said memorials. The Urban Crucible, The Northern Seaports and the Origins of the American Revolution by Gary Nash. Founding Martyr, The Life and Death of Dr. Joseph Warren, the American Revolution's Lost Hero by Christian Despigna. The Atlas of Boston History, edited by Nancy S. Seasholes. Colonial Massachusetts, A History by Benjamin W. LaBarrie. Tracts of the American Revolution, 1763 to 1776, edited by Merrill Jensen. The Glorious Revolution in America by David S. Lovejoy. Liberty Tree, A Genealogy by Arthur M. Schlesinger, published in the New England Quarterly, Volume 25, Number 4, December 1952. A Note on Mobs in the American Revolution by Gordon S. Wood, published in the William and Mary Quarterly, Volume 23, Number 4, October 1966. Boston and the Nurturing of Newspapers, Dimensions of the Cradle, 1690 to 1741, by Charles E. Clark, published in the New England Quarterly, Volume 26, Number 2, June 1991. John Wilkes and the American Disillusionment with Britain, by Pauline Meyer, published in William and Mary Quarterly, Volume 20, Number 3, July 1963. Why the Colony's Most Galvanizing Patriot Never Became a Founding Father, by Eric Trickey, published in the Smithsonian Magazine, May 5, 2017. And Deliverance from Luxury, Pope's Day, Conflict, and Consensus in Colonial Boston, 1745 to 1765, by Francis D. Cogliano, published in Studies in Popular Culture, 1993, Volume 15, Number 2, 1993.